Hi guys, Olive here today to talk about what I read in January 2024. There is just one quick thing I wanted to mention before I start talking about the books. I did a good amount of reading during the month of January, but I have made the choice to not talk about a small handful of the books that I read in January, and that's because I would like to reserve those to talk about them in a video that I'm going to be making here soon. I don't know exactly when, but it will be soon. I know I'm being vague about this, but I've been kind of working up the courage to make that video for quite some time now because it's going to be a lot more personal. It has to do with things that have been going on with me over the past 2 years or so. If you go to my Goodreads page and you deduce which of the books I'm talking about based on the ones I read in January but that weren't featured here, if you figure out what those books are, then you are probably going to know what I am getting ready to talk about. But I'm just not quite ready yet. I'm also doing a little bit more reading that has to do with that, so I figured it made sense to wait and then talk about them in that upcoming video. But as I said, I did quite a bit of reading during January, so there are still a ton of books to talk about, many of which I thought were wonderful. So let's get started. I'm going to start with the novels. There were 2 of them, and the first one I'm going to talk about, it was one of my favorite reads of the entire month, and I would now consider it one of my all-time favorite classics. It's The Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain. I read this book because of my Wishbone series, because they adapted it for one of the Wishbone episodes, and I make my What's the Story Wishbone videos. I am so grateful that Wishbone adapted this one because I highly doubt I would have read this book otherwise, and I adored this. This is a work of historical fiction. It is a fictionalized account of the life of the real-life historical figure Joan of Arc. But for a novel, it is quite historically accurate as far as I've been able to gather, and that makes sense because Mark Twain spent 12 years researching this, then he spent an additional 2 years writing it, and all of that care he poured into this book really shows, and his deep admiration for Joan of Arc is evident. He portrays her in this novel as just a creature too good for this world. Kind, brave, pious, beautiful, just inherently good to the core. Everything we know about Joan of Arc, the reports of her visions of saints that were telling her to go to war to help win the 100 Years' War, her appeal to the king for troops to help lead the French to victory, and then finally to those devastating heresy trials. It is all in here, and it is all written in such a captivating, absorbing way. I was just glued to this book the whole way through. I kept having to remind myself that Mark Twain wrote this. It is nothing like his other books. Now, granted, I haven't read all of his catalog. I read Huck Finn in high school, and then for my Wishbone series as well, I read Tom Sawyer and then The Prince and the Pauper. But from what I know of Mark Twain, from reading those 3 books and from what I hear, this book bears no resemblance to any of his other works. So I would say, even if you normally don't like Mark Twain novels, this one is safe to pick up because it will remind you of no other Mark Twain novel. I highly recommend picking this up, especially if you have an interest in the life of Joan of Arc. It is just truly something special. And if you would like to see how the writers of Wishbone adapted this work for a kids show, I will link my latest episode of What's the Story Wishbone for you in the description box and up in the cards. The only other novel I picked up during the month of January wasn't as winning of an experience, I am very sorry to say. I'm actually quite surprised that I did not end up loving Go as a River by Shelley Reed, which the main character of this book is another teenager. Joan of Arc was a teenager, in case you didn't know that. But this heroine's name is Victoria, and right at the start of this novel, we see her, by chance, meet a Native American drifter to whom she is instantly attracted, and that encounter goes on to change the rest of her life. Victoria lives on her family's peach orchard in Colorado, performing all the domestic duties for her father, brother, and uncle with whom she lives, until eventually she's drawn away. She does end up coming back and begins to run the peach orchard, but she comes back with a lot of baggage. This one had a lot of promise. The writing is gorgeous. I will absolutely give that to the author. And especially the way she writes the initial meeting between Victoria and Will, who is the man she meets. The chemistry between those two is absolutely electric. You could feel the pull that they felt toward each other. After reading that scene, I thought that spectacular things were in store for me with the rest of this novel, but although the writing stayed beautiful the whole way through, the plot really meanders. And it does something that I personally really don't like in novels. I don't like when we're moving along at a steady pace in terms of how time is passing within the novel. Then all of a sudden you blink and years have gone by. I really don't like that. And this one is so guilty of doing that. And then it concludes with an info dump so massive that it rivals a mystery novel. Pretty much this whole thing was just really strange. That is how I would characterize this reading experience. Just strange. I kept waiting and waiting and waiting to have the experience that other readers seem to have had with this book. I swear, if you look at other people's Goodreads reviews, you're going to think I'm out of my mind because it seems like a universally appreciated book, but that experience just never came to fruition for me. But speaking of fruit, I will say it was a huge mistake on my part to not read this book during peach season because of that peach orchard factor. To say that I love fruit would be a comical understatement. And the fact that I couldn't read this book with a peach in my hand, jail. Directly to jail. So if you still want to read this after hearing me pan it, at the very, very least, please wait until peaches are ripe. Things started to look up with my nonfiction reads of the month, though. One of the 24 nonfiction books I wanted to make a point of reading in 2024 was also about food, on the topic of food, but more specifically, it also discusses our food system here in the United States of America. That book is The Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan. The pickle that this title refers to is exclusive to omnivores, because with all of these choices out there of what to eat, what do we choose? And then he goes on to talk about the way the food system here in the States narrows those choices, how they're trying to force just an unimaginable amount of corn on all of us, and then what that surplus ultimately means for our health. But he also looks outside of that system, asking questions like, what if animals weren't raised on factory farms? And what if we were to go back to the foraging ways of our ancestors? So essentially in this book, I would say he looks at the way that we as Americans eat within the food system, but then also questions how and if we could work outside of it. I found this was a pretty natural extension of The Botany of Desire, which was the first book of his I had ever read. It was the book of his that was on my list for last year, my priority nonfiction books for 2023. So that continuity was nice. And I have to agree with what a lot of other people say about this book. It will make you see food production, and what we eat a whole lot differently. But he is incredibly balanced in his approach. You can tell he's not trying to force any one viewpoint on you as he's presenting all different sides to these different arguments. And he's just an incredible writer. He presents you with so much information in all of his books, at least the two I've read thus far, but he makes it feel so much like dinner conversation that you don't even realize how much your mind is being expanded. And I know there are some nonfiction readers out there who feel really pressured to retain a lot of what they learn in nonfiction books, and they feel guilty if they can't remember all the facts they're presented with. I can tell you Michael Pollan's style naturally leads more to retention after you read one of his books because he's made it feel so much like conversation. It feels like you're just picking up this information from a friend. If you are interested in this subject, specifically the chapters in here about meat production, I found that a lot in this book reminded me of two books I read and reviewed last spring. They were two books on cows. And so if you haven't seen that video of mine, I will link it for you below and up in the cards because I feel like those two books and this book really go hand in hand with meat production and farming. Just a lot of the same subjects are discussed. So just a little bonus, read this, then that for you. My other January pick off of that priority nonfiction books list is a very popular one, and it's one that a lot of people seem to adore, but it just didn't do it for me. It's Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer, this author's story of his experience of a deadly Mount Everest climb back in the 1990s. I think what ultimately ended up not working for me about this book is something that the author admits right up front, and I agree with him. It was too soon for him to write this book. As he was writing this, it was clear that he was still confused about the whole situation. He wasn't seeing things clearly up on the mountain. So he was still trying to process everything, things that he thought were true, things that he knew to be true and later found out weren't true, that they were mixed around. He was still trying to process through all of those details and the survivor's guilt, all of those emotions as he was writing this. And so it kind of felt like he was subjecting his readers, me in the moment I was reading this, to what he would have spoken about in the therapy sessions he should have been in instead. So this book is a lot of just recounting the mission. Who was where when, what Krakauer knew when, what he thought was true, but then later on finds out isn't true based on other people's reports. It's a lot of that. I will say, though, toward the beginning of this book, I did really like that we got a little bit of a history lesson about the ascents of Mount Everest. And then also there's a discussion in here about how big of a business climbing Mount Everest has become. I did really like that. That saved this book a little bit for me. But pretty much all the rest of it is about the climb. And I kept waiting to feel thrilled by this book because a lot of reviewers mentioned that they felt thrilled by this book, those moments that just had them ripping through this book. I kept waiting for those moments, but all I kept getting were kind of the equivalent of confused captain's logs. It just wasn't for me. And I feel like I'm extra bummed about that because this is such a popular work of nonfiction. So many people love this. I actually had people assuring me that I was going to love it as much as they do. I was so excited to pick this up, and it was the perfect time of year to pick it up too, and it just did not work for me. So kind of like with Go as a River by Shelley Reed, which also has stellar reviews, it makes me take a step back and wonder, like, did we read the same book? Did I read it upside down? Like, how can my experience of these books be so different than that of other people? But I can tell you that after having read this, I kind of wish I would have just read a book about the commercialization of Mount Everest climbs, because as I said, that's what interested me most about this book. And wouldn't you know it, there is one coming out in April called Everest Inc. It sounds great. I kind of wish I would have just waited and read that instead. But let's move on to a book I did really enjoy, The City Game by Matthew Goodman, the story of an absolutely electric college basketball team back in the 1940s. They played for City College in New York City, and they were absolutely on top of the world until a number of their players got mixed up in a point-shaving scandal, which tarnished their reputation and their victories. This was such a thrill. And the way that it's written and organized actually reminded me a lot of The Poisoner's Handbook by Deborah Bloom, which is a huge compliment, by the way. That is one of my all-time nonfiction favorites. But just the way that she juggles several different histories happening within New York City, so does Matthew Goodman in this book. You get so much bang for your buck in this book. You will learn about a ton. We learn about City College itself, what kind of kids went there. Then, of course, the basketball team, the coaches, and the individual players, all the different personalities, all of their stories. We meet some of the shady characters who were involved in that point shaving game. We're told just how much money there was to be made in such a scheme, why it caught the interest of investigators who really dug in and exposed these guys, and then as a consequence, outed these players for being on their payroll. This book was just absolute dynamite. I can't say, though, that this one is completely accessible to you, even if you don't know anything about basketball. There is some terminology used during those basketball sections that I don't think a non-basketball fan would have a chance of understanding. But this book has so much more to offer than just basketball. Even if you don't like basketball, I think it's worth hanging in there to get a full picture of this situation and also New York City at this time. I love when a history book doesn't just recount facts that happened in the past, but actually makes the time period come to life for you so you feel like you're really there. This book did that for me. This is a winner for sure. But swinging back to one that I didn't think was as impressive, From the Corner of the Oval by Beck Dory Stein is a memoir written by a woman who worked in Obama's White House in the lead up to his second term and then throughout his second term. And in this book, she discusses traveling around, becoming friends with other staffers, and getting herself caught up in an absolutely toxic situationship that was outside of her real relationship. I made sure to emphasize the interpersonal drama within that mini summary just now, because that's what dominates this book. I personally went into this memoir hoping to learn a little more about the work itself. She said she was a stenographer, but it's pretty clear she didn't know shorthand. So that's not a stenographer. Instead, she was just transcribing taped speeches and meetings for the record and to give to media, I think it was. It's work that she didn't seem to have any respect for, nor did anyone else. As I've said in at least one other wrap-up in previous months, I really like to read about people's jobs, their careers, what they spend the majority of their time doing. I like to learn about that. So it was really disappointing that so much of that was sacrificed to talk about all of the interpersonal stuff. Not necessarily the friendships. I thought those were nice to read about, but specifically that toxic situationship she had with that guy. It made absolutely no sense to me how she kept pining after this guy. When she was in a different relationship, he was in a different relationship. He was very clear that he didn't want to date her. He essentially admitted that he was just going to keep using her as long as she permitted it, and she kept permitting it, and then kept being surprised when they found themselves back in the same cycle over and over again over the course of her time at this job. It was just absolutely infuriating to read about. You just wanted to reach through the book and shake her. And to talk about that so much instead of anything else about this really once-in-a-lifetime experience was a choice. I will say she definitely can write. I have read her novel that she wrote after this memoir. It was really good. And her discovering her own identity as a writer is part of this. So that was really nice. Hearing about all of her friendships was great. Getting a peek inside of Obama's White House was very intriguing. But I definitely didn't get what I came for. But then finally, in the month of January, I read 2 books on moths. Much Ado About Mothing by James Loewen, a travel memoir meets natural history about how this author chased opportunities to see different species of moths across Britain for a calendar year. And The Jewel Box by Tim Blackburn, which I like to call an ecology class you can fit in your hand. In this one, the author uses a moth trap to demonstrate several different ecological theories. These books both discuss moths, but they could not be more different, except for the fact that I did learn a lot from both of them. If you are interested in hearing more about one or both of these, I'll pop a link to the full video I made discussing both of them in the description box and up in the cards. So, with the exception of those few books that I said I would be leaving out of this video, those were all the books that I read during the month of January. If you have thoughts on any of these books, if you have any feedback or questions for me, please feel free to put any or all of that down in the comment section below. Links to all of the books that I talked about in this video, as well as links to any of my other videos that I may have mentioned throughout this video, all of those will be in the description box below for your clicking convenience. And at the very bottom of the exact same description box, you'll also see links to everywhere you can find me around the internets. Goodreads, Instagram, the Story Graph, all the places I'm the most active, in case you want to keep up with what I'm reading and doing right now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.